Next speaker need to be very sharp in time. Sorry for that. Is Sven Ehmann. He's leading a think tank team at Infographic Groups in Berlin. So his topic will be about the data visualization, infographics, and so on. I'm very curious because this is part of my everyday job. So stage is yours.
I'm not good at keeping the time, I should say. Let's see, maybe I can. Actually, the first part of what I want to talk about ties in quite nicely to what we just heard because it's almost as, it feels like a therapy session. It's like talking a little bit about like something that changed in my life as well, and why it happened, how it plays out, and where we're at right now. So for pretty much a decade, I had what I considered my dream job. I was working as the creative director for a publishing company called Gestalten. If you're a designer, you probably came across one of the books that we did. And my job was essentially looking at the stuff that I was interested in for work. And then I would gather the stuff that I liked the most, and I put it together in a book, and then we would publish it and distribute it. And eventually I would speak at conferences and people would come to me and say like, wow, I was in this book and it really helped my career and I'm so thankful. So that was a great time, obviously. But since I'm like super curious, I ended up having like a lot of topics, like juggling topics at the same time. And I kind of reached a level where I felt like this, And what was coming down was not like plagues, it was more like information. I wish I could animate it. Did I tell you that I'm not a designer? No, I'm not a designer, bear with me. Like you'll see on the slides. But I came from this editorial background, right? So I'm like looking at design work, I have a background in photography and journalism, so I feel I can understand what's quality, I can pick what's good, what's new, what's relevant, and it was essentially too much. So my day work turned from being my dream job to being a job where I would essentially build like filters on my inside of my head, but also physically or digitally on my desktop, filling everything that came along me into like trash and important trash. So that was the stuff that I definitely don't want to look at, and I don't want to waste my time with. And this is the stuff I want to look at, but I don't have time for, because there's so much more coming. And eventually I felt like, I need some help. This needs to change, because I was losing the passion for the stuff that I was looking at. I was at the moment at a point in life where I felt like, if I do another book on like beautiful little houses on fancy remote locations, I'll give up. It doesn't work anymore. Which doesn't mean that these books shouldn't be there and that the publisher shouldn't do the books anymore. I was just not the right person in that job anymore. And so, because I was dealing with design and visual culture and all sorts of creative disciplines and visual storytelling, I was looking around to see where the sort of stereotype design person or company or context would be that would help me not just like gather and connect and edit, but even help create relevant content. Because the situation we're in, coming back to that little animation and the poorly put icons of social media platforms, the situation I feel we're in right now is a little bit like this statement sums up by Buzz Aldrin. We went out and everything looked so promising, the internet seems to be this like amazing space, and then all we got was Facebook, which kind of kills time, prevents us from having better ideas and doing this stuff just as you described it. Instead of doing it, we're just looking at other people doing it. So that didn't work anymore. So I was looking back at the kind of projects I did, and the books that I was most passionate about were infographic books. These are some of the books that I helped come about. I had the pleasure to work with a number of very interesting and inspiring people. You might recognize the work of Francesco Franchi, There's a book like The Look Inside, which was done with Juan, who is or used to be at that time the creative director at National Geographic. Photoviz was a collaboration with Nicholas Felton. So like top-notch people with like a very like the same type of passion that I felt about doing books, but they somehow managed to transfer that into their own creations rather than just being visitors as I was. So I kind of started running, like spending more of my personal time on this subject, and that led to two exhibition projects that I curated together with the Graphic Design Festival in Breda in the Netherlands. And it was like kind of attached to what I did for work, but I did some of the work during office hours, but not at all. And we tried to like open up the conversation because we felt it was relevant enough to not just talk to designers about design, but introduce the subject matter of infographics and data visualization to a larger audience. That's the mindset of this festival in Breda. And the first exhibition was called Smaller Stories, Bigger Pictures, and we looked at the creators of infographics and their almost typologies. So there was the journalist, the activist, the poet, and the scientist, I think. So different ways of telling their stories through infographics and with a different intention, different language used. And the second exhibition we did afterwards was Resolute, and it's more about activism and how designers can take a social, responsible activity up, but it also involved a lot of infographics, and that led from me still being, in this case, a more of a curator and editor of contents to also commissioning stuff for a third exhibition that I did, a different subject matter in Łódź in Poland. But you see these, like the posters here, they are essentially explaining the exhibits in an infographic/comic type of thing. And since all of that, like the work that I did at Gestalten, as well as the work that I did like on the side, led into this direction, I decided a little over a year ago to quit working in this dream job to take on a new challenge, let's put it that way. So I joined a company called the Infographics Group. The company exists for over 11 years. They used to be Golden Section Graphics beforehand, and they grew like organically, as most design studios do, from the founder and a few people to the founder and a few more people. And then I think they were at, I don't know, 15, 16 people, and realized something that I guess a lot of agencies realized, that they were too big for small clients and too small for big clients. And usually that's a very difficult situation to be in. They were lucky in the sense because they found two business partners, one from a design and technology background, and the other one is not like the typical investor, but somebody who actually brings in the money, so that the company can grow beyond, that from one project to the other. And that led to a situation where now we moved from 15, 16 people to about 50. And we have a core business, which is like a traditional design agency, but then there are three other pillars that we're working on, sort of behind the scenes, which is another way of saying we're not ready yet. But there is a digital platform about infographics that's going to launch next year. There is a section where we try to take a more active position in publishing, not as publishers, but as authors of content. Books might be one outcome, but it's not limited to books. And then what I'm working on is what we call, for the lack of a better term, the think tank. And the intention here is that we do like a 360-degree research, and we look for interesting challenges at the intersection, like in the sweet spot between emerging technology, topics, and audiences. So, like one example is augmented reality for kids in a museum, or machine learning for engineers in space. Could be. It's not exactly what we're working on right now. But this is like the structure of the company. We have these four pillars, and the core of what we do is testing the ground for future business, essentially. But to frame a little more of where the company comes from and what infographics for us means, it's really info and graphics. The people that work there are usually having, I mean, they're graphic designers, communication designers, illustrators, but they have a strong journalistic background as well. So the core criteria for everything we do is that it needs to be right. That if it's not right, anything else doesn't matter. It needs to be right. It needs to be accessible. What we do is not art. We're trying to communicate a certain type of story. We try to explain something. We try to make people smarter, ideally. The time that they spend with us should actually make them understand the subject matter better. And ideally, it's also original. So within the work, this is some of the stuff I'm showing in the beginning. I was a bit older. There's a strong focus on graphic design, on illustration, a bit of 3D graphics as well. This, for example, is a map that shows how individual words from the German language are used in other languages around the world. A project that started, like many others, as a side project somehow. Somebody came up with an idea, and then it grew a little bit, and then eventually we ended up having this produced together with the Goethe-Institut, which is this German cultural institute, and sold it as a poster as well. Then there is a lot of work in the earlier days for media outlets. As you see here, is more illustration based. One is about the one on the right is about islands that are separated, so the border of a country going through an island, and what that means, and that eventually there are a couple of islands where that's the place. And then on the other side, it's the Red Sea. I don't know if you know, the guy they found up in the mountains, kind of old and cold and dead. But it's trying to find interesting little details that visuals can explain better. And there's also some a basic element that was present in this project that Jan, actually the founder of the company, did a couple of years ago for the New York Times Magazine. There was a series on exceptional diseases. So for each disease, there was a medical writer who described what the disease was, and he was actually illustrating where it hit you. And it's, again, what I think is important here is that with each and everything we do, we really try to tell that story. So you should be able to see and understand better. Eventually, there is not a house style. There's not something that you could recognize as being an infographics group graphic, just in terms of the aesthetics. And that's on purpose. We try to be very flexible. There are a lot of different designers in the studio. They have their styles to a certain extent, but they're also very capable. It's interesting for me to see, to pick up each other's work and continue. And then some have favorites and are more in data visualization, so it's more nerdy maybe. And then others have an interest in more a comic illustration style. And this is a project that started as a I think 3-spread story in our own magazine, in Infographics magazine. And then it was turned around into an animation as well, and into a scroll graphic for online and a slideshow graphic. So in this case, we also tried to find out how does a story work across different media. So I'll just give you a little impression. I'm not showing the full thing because I guess that's the only place where I can cut some time. There's sound actually on this one.
After U.S. President Donald Trump was elected, the clock was advanced to just 2.5 minutes to midnight.
So this is about this idea
that
of the doomsday period. How close are we to a nuclear catastrophe, essentially? And it's a comic-style animation that then involves a couple of infographic elements. So there's a bit of mapping involved. There's a bit of process charts involved. There are a couple of you see the suitcase, and all the elements are in the suitcase. The person that kind of carries it around with the president all the time. So the idea is that if you would just write it down as an instruction or a one-pager text, you could still understand it, of course, but turning it into a comic-style animation, it will probably talk to a different type of audience as well, and that's also why this intersection between topic technology and audience is so important. Is if you only do it because there's a fancy technology, then it might not reach your audience. If the topic's super well taught but only the experts understand it, it's also not useful. So we try to combine it there. So I'll cut this. You'll find it online if you're interested to see the full thing. And we also do try to address younger audiences. That's something that we push a lot for right now with a couple of book project ideas. This one actually is a book that was done with Gestalten. I was not involved at that time. But it is, it shows and explains how the human body works. It's actually the same illustrator that did the Trump animation before, Ehmann. And this is, I mean, most of what you've seen so far is like self-initiated, originally self-initiated, and then it grew into something like a project or product. But we also work for clients, and the challenge here is to find stories that are actually worth telling and that are probably interesting enough and they haven't discovered themselves yet. So in this case, the initial, the client was the insurance company that sponsored this soccer stadium in Munich. And so there are a couple of graphics explaining the architecture and how great it is, but the actual key visual shows you every single person that's in the stadium when a game is running. So you have the players obviously and the coaches. So this is the one team. Damn. Here's the other. There's the referees in the middle. There's the little mascot on the side, and then all the fans up there. And it was kind of interesting because I was telling you that the core first step to take is make sure that the data is right, and finding out who and how, or not who, but how many people actually are inside. There was no simple answer. So we had the research part was the actual challenge in here, getting the actual numbers, like the people that we thought were in charge, they didn't know. And then we had to go through, talk to every single vendor in the stadium, how many people do you have on the ground? So, and it's also finding the beauty in something that might not be visible at first sight. This is a company, some trouble that does lighting fixtures. So, high quality architectural lighting, and it's supposed to be created about lighting in architecture and lighting and how it works. So, it's like physics essentially, and instead of turning it into a schoolbook aesthetic or like a manual, it was turned into something that has this spectrum of colors and is hopefully more inviting for people to actually not just look at, but also put up on the wall and enjoy on an aesthetic level for all that. One of the most interesting challenges that we've had, and that is pretty much a year ago, was we were in the process of kind of brainstorming how we would like to work with clients in the future. And something that we realized was that big corporations often have extremely well structured corporate designs. They have a very sophisticated way of dealing with their advertising, but whenever you look at their graphics, it's crap. So you see, I don't know, name any company, you look at all the things I mentioned, they're all like needy and tidy and beautiful, and then you look at their PowerPoint charts and they're just like a waste of, they're just impossible. If you're lucky, they're just boring, but more often they're actually wrong. Because people, often they don't know what a graph really is and what it does, and then you have pie charts ending up to 150%, and yeah, that's where we come in. So a company that approached us, and they were surprisingly aware of that challenge, was Lufthansa, a German airline. And they were in the process of redesigning their core brand identity, both for the airline and the group above it. And the starting point of our conversation was just about very traditional graphics as you would find them in an annual report. But then in the process of working together, we actually came to the conclusion, and they were brave enough to commission that, to work on an infographic system and an illustration system, side to side. So what you see here is it's in the process of internal verification, so you only occasionally see first glimpses of it in their the board book magazine and their communication yet, but it's kind of rolling out over the next Ehmann probably. What you see here is a mix of like an illustration style that's very dynamic. Actually, you can there are at least 3-4 different layers, from like very simple on the left-hand corner to like more editorial on the bottom, and then they all go together with infographics as well. So that again, the idea is that you could attract someone visually, and you can get the, like, involved in a story, and then they will probably have a different approach to reading graphics as well. That's a big, interesting challenge for us in the future to work on this level with more and other large companies, hopefully. But then, this is kind of a more complex project, and often enough, what makes a great project is, and that's been said, I think, throughout the days, it's a simple idea, and not necessarily a very complex or super technical or very advanced way of realizing it. So one of the projects that we internally consider the most successful was this poster exhibition that we created for the anniversary of the Reformation, and it consisted of, I don't know, like 30 plus posters. Each one had a different like topic and style and infographics, so it was the full spectrum of infographics. And the beautiful thing here was that it was meant to be like a highly flexible exhibition setup. So the posters were available, and people could order or download them, print them themselves. There were even a set of 3D objects that you could 3D print yourself for running your own exhibition. And this exhibition went around the world in very small and not design-like locations, so you get some impressions. Like a lot of like church institutions, but also embassies and libraries, just got the posters, put them up wherever. My favorite is here in Bogota, where they put it like on the stairs outside. And like that is something where we're reaching a completely unexpected bandwidth of people. Coming back to this idea of being approachable, accessible, this is actually probably the best example for something that reached a lot of people that would never have seen it if it was part of a design exhibition. And yeah, it was a poster exhibition, so it was very simple, easy to reproduce, and yet there was this exposure. And another project that also had, there's a lot of other infographics in it, but there's one thing I want to focus on. Is a project we did with an orchestra in Bavaria, and together with the office of Mirko Borsche, like a design office in Germany, who was in charge of doing their program, like the season program. And usually, we would get commissioned to do some illustrations, but in this case, we wanted to go do something a little unusual, and so we wired up 4 musicians and the conductor during their testing and their, what do you call it? Practicing, essentially. And there's this, the piece they played is one where this guy with the hammer has one go. There's one point where he has to hit the wooden block, and that's, he was like, his heartbeat was similar to the one of a Formula 1 racer. So you can see how the heartbeats of the different people were raising up to the point where he hit on the cover of this program. So that's like a fun project. It's something where we try to explore also the possibility of gathering our own data more. And then throughout the whole publication, we had not just a style, but like a variety of different graphics, very different aesthetics, as well as a bit of like mapping, infographic, the 3D models of airplanes. Where do the musicians go? Where do their instruments go? Some Lego work. And like one of my favorites, because it's so simple, is an analysis of like the week schedule of the whole orchestra. So it was analyzing like a lot of schedules and Excel tables, and then the outcome is very poetic. It's just like a composition of that week, so you can see how the rhythm of their work is throughout the week. And this already, with the taking our own data from the heartbeat of the musicians, it kind of indicates a direction that we want to push much further in the think tank as well, telling stories in ways that we ourselves haven't done yet, and hopefully will also be interesting for collaborators in the future. So a project that just launched, I think a few days ago, is a visual story on the woman's right to vote, which also has its anniversary right now. And that was a long project. It started from somebody who's doing what we call the academy program within the company. So it's a way for like young professionals to get like into the world of infographics. They join us for a year, work on commission projects and their own projects, and then it grew further and further, more and more people being involved, and it was like a big whole wall full of drawings and pictures and clippings and everything. It looked quite amazing, but it was very difficult to get that transported. And then we decided to try Instagram as a format. So we now have a number of different small units, and if they're posted, you will, in the stream, you'll get the bigger picture eventually. And another type of technology we're playing a lot with, and that's the core actually of what the think tank has done over the last year, is augmented reality. So there was a project that we did with the foundation, with the Berlin Wall Foundation. It's a museum right next to where the wall used to be. Again, the basis was a poster set, and then because the data was there, like the 3D data of the towers and the structures, we did a first, well, it's a sketch prototype of how you would like to use this, as a tourist in the city. So you would see like the leftovers of the building, but you could explore in more detail what it was, what the inside looked like, what the purpose was. And you could eventually go through the whole city along where the wall used to be and explore it in that manner. And that initially was just like a conceptual sketch, but we took time to discuss it further, and something that we've worked on in more detail now is like the same concept applied to art, like an exhibition context where, I don't know, you're probably familiar with that situation. You're in front of an artwork, maybe you're alone, and you're lucky and you can spend your time, but maybe it's Mona Lisa and there's a million other people, and there's not the time to really like access the information. There's no one to ask, why this like apple here in the corner. And the idea is that we offer more of this information to visitors, to like anyone essentially, from children to like grown-ups, from very passionate art lovers or experts to somebody who just happened to be inside because it was raining outside. So the project we created so far has two dimensions based on this image by Kranach. There's a move into the picture, which unfortunately we haven't filmed yet, but what it does is it kind of puts the image in like layers so that you can almost have a 3D image effect, and then you can access different parts of the picture, and you can see the relationship between, like the, it's hard to see, but there's like blood going down. You can see where it goes from where to where, what the relationship is, what the meaning is of the different characters in the picture. You can zoom in on the city in the background. There's actually like a stick with a snake on it, and then we explain why that image. And then, so this is like zooming into the picture, and the other idea is that you zoom out and you show the context beyond what the exhibition can show. So you could show other works by the same artist, other works the same era, similar subject, or completely different stories. So one idea that we're currently working on is that, if you go to a museum exhibition with this type of imagery with a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old, it might be hard to get them excited, but if you start telling them about the snake just as a story about snakes, you might win an hour to enjoy the other side that you're interested in. So there's a lot of these aspects. Again, anything that we do here tries to explain more. So our overall company motto is enabling knowledge. That was the first chart. So we try to avoid graphics that are just pretty or nice or fancy looking, so not the graphic infographic porn that we saw a lot over the last years as well. Rather do something that actually has an educational outcome. That sounds a bit boring maybe, but I believe in the fact that with so much information coming at us, it actually matters to produce stuff that has a meaning, has a relevance, and you feel not just like exhausted afterwards, but you feel you learned something and you're smart. At the beginning of this year, we hired a team of data journalists. They came from a newspaper in Berlin and have been working on election data, like live, real-time data representation during elections. And they're still like in the process of integrating. They've done the first couple of projects. I'm going to show one right after this. But they also started a little blog, and it's kind of funny for me to see how they approach subjects. So this is something that doesn't really look like much, but it's actually quite smart. It is the starting point was that we realized that a lot of what we produce is probably not as simple as it should be. So it's still quite complex and not as accessible as we wish it to be. And then we talked about the relevance of the visual, but also the relevance of the language in the picture and how you can explain it and what language do you need, where do you need text, and then what does the text actually say. And they produced this little piece where you can copy and paste any text in here, and you would see, based on an analysis of it's like Wikipedia data and other like online sources, how common the words used are. So you can essentially say, okay, this is something that I can expect anyone to understand. This is all white, and then the darker it gets, the more unlikely it is that people actually understand what you're trying to say. So ideally, this could, in the end, could be a tool for us, and we run all our text through this, like along with an editor, preferably, to just optimize the understandability of the text that we're creating inside of the graphics. And that's again, it's something that's more of a prototype. We'll see where it goes. Right now, it just lives on the block, and but it's an attitude, I think, that also is interesting internally to probe with anyone working on a project. You know, how much of an effort did you actually do to make sure you're not just good looking, smart, but you're ready to be understood. And the final project I want to share is something that we just did a few weeks ago. A consulting company that also does a lot of executive training approached us to create graphics for one of their networking events. And initially the idea was that we would show some network, like fancy looking graphics, and then the outcome in the end was kind of surprising, I think, for most of the visitors, because what we did was we looked at their, like the LinkedIn and German equivalent is called Xing, data of all the companies that were present in the event, and you could see the relationship. So if you come in and you work for like Lufthansa, for example, and there's someone else from Adidas, you could see how many people went either way. So you could essentially, they were representatives of individual companies, but they could see where their own personal future might be, and they could see who is not, how a competition between them and companies that were not in their industry actually existed, because people moved from, insurance company to bank to car manufacturer. So it was very decorative, so it was very beautiful to look at, but when we talked about it, it actually made them like, oh, do I want this? Do I want to see this here? Do I want to see where my people go, or do I want others to see where I get my people from? So it steered a very interesting conversation throughout the evening, and I guess in the end it was also a beautiful decoration along a 15 meter long wall screen. So this is what we do. I think in the end, this idea of enabling knowledge is something that I would encourage anyone to maybe play around with a little bit, because I think it's a pretty strong criteria to measure the quality of your work against. You might do it very differently. You might do it in all sorts of different formats, but I feel if there's more relevance in the world, then I will probably end up not having this like super filled basket of like trash and important trash anymore, but just like good stuff that it's actually worth looking at. Thank you very much.